The gun was already in Ida Covington's hand when Benjamin Townsend walked through the door of the Harrow Creek Sheriff's office, and she did not lower it. "You knew," she said. Her voice did not shake. It had not shaken in 3 years, not since the Cimarron River swallowed her father's farm whole, and she had pulled herself out of the mud with nothing but a flour sack and a will that frightened people who did not know her, and frightened them more when they did. "You knew about Harlan this whole time, and you said nothing." Benjamin held his hands out slow, palms open, the way a man holds his hands when he is telling the truth and needs the other person to see that. He was tall, lean in the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from Red Canyon stone. His badge caught the last of the evening light coming through the single warped window. "Ida," he said, "put the gun down. Let me explain. Explaining is what cowards do when they have already let the damage happen. Then call me a coward, but listen while you do it." She kept the revolver level at his chest. Outside, Harrow Creek, Texas, was going about its Thursday evening business horses at the rail. A piano poorly played, the smell of mesquite smoke and cattle dust that she had come to know so well she barely noticed it anymore. Inside this small office with its single oil lamp and its wanted posters and the cold iron stove in the corner, the whole shape of the last 8 months was changing into something she did not recognize. "Harlan Voss was your informant," she said. Benjamin did not flinch. "Yes. And he was going to be my husband." "Yes. And you used him, you used me. You used what we were." She stopped. The word for what they were had never been spoken between them, and she was not going to speak it here, not like this, not with a gun between them that she was fully prepared to fire. "You used the situation." "I used the situation to stop a man who was running guns to 3 separate outlaw gangs and had already killed 4 marshals," Benjamin said, and his voice was steady but his eyes were not. His eyes were dark and full of something that looked like grief, and she had learned over these 8 months to read his eyes the way a seasoned scout reads the land. "And yes, I know what it cost you. I know what I took from you without asking, and I have not slept more than 3 hours a night since the day I realized it." The lamp flickered between them. Ida Covington lowered the gun. She had survived a flood that took everything she owned. She had survived a fire that took everything she had rebuilt. She had survived a broken engagement that took everything she had believed about love and safety and the future. She was not sure she was going to survive Benjamin Townsend. The Cimarron River had been rising for 6 days before it took the Covington farm in the spring of 1879. Ida had been 23 years old, standing in the second-floor doorway of a farmhouse that was no longer on land but on water, watching the brown current take the fence posts and the chicken coop and the wagon her father had built by hand the year she was born. Her father, Gerald Covington, had already been taken. He had gone back in for the mule, which was a thing that made no sense to anyone with sense. But her father had loved that mule the way other men loved their horses, and he had gone back in, and the river had made its decision. She had stayed in that doorway until the water reached her knees, and then she had taken the flour sack that was hanging on a nail, and she had put into it the things she could reach. A small Bible that had been her mother's, a folding knife her brother had left behind when he went to war and did not come back, $11 in paper money that was already damp, and a tintype photograph of her family taken in 1872 when they were still whole. Then she had climbed out onto the sloping roof, and she had held on until the farmhouse came to rest against a stand of cottonwood trees 2 miles from where it had started, and she had climbed down those cottonwood trees into mud that came to her thighs, and she had walked toward the high ground she could see in the distance, and she had not cried until she reached it. A woman named Clara Finch had taken her in at Dodge City, which was the nearest place with walls and a roof. Clara ran a boarding house and had opinions about everything, and was kind in the rough, practical way of frontier women, who had learned that sentiment was a luxury and competence was what actually saved people. She fed Ida, gave her dry clothes, and found her a job washing dishes at a restaurant called the Red Curtain. Ida worked there for 14 months. She saved money. She wrote letters to an aunt in Abilene who sent a condolence note and $12 and did not write again. She learned to cook meals she had never cooked before, to smile at customers when she did not feel like smiling, to count her coins at night and calculate the distance between where she was and where she needed to be. Where she needed to be was a question she was still working out. She had met Harlan Voss at the Red Curtain on a Thursday evening in October of 1880. He was charming in the way that men who have practiced being charming are charming effortlessly, which meant it took effort she could not see. He wore clean clothes and had good teeth and spoke to her like she was worth speaking to rather than around, which was not as common as it should have been. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. He told her he was a cattle broker. He described his work in enough detail that she had no reason to disbelieve him. He knew the right names, the right towns, the right prices per head. He asked her about herself with what seemed like genuine curiosity and listened to the answers with what seemed like genuine interest. By March of 1880, he had proposed marriage and she had said yes. She had said yes because she was 25 years old and had been building a life from scratch for nearly 2 years, and she was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been doing everything alone. And because he was kind to her, or seemed to be, and because the alternative continuing to save coins and write unanswered letters and sleep in Clara Finch's boarding house listening to the wind come off the plains felt like a life that would narrow rather than open. She had said yes, and she had been happy, and then in June of 1881, 2 weeks before the wedding, the barn of the man she was renting a room from in Caldwell, Kansas, where she had moved to be closer to Harlan, burned to the ground. The fire had started, the sheriff said, from a lantern knocked over by a startled horse. The barn was lost entirely. The house was saved by a bucket line that included every able-bodied person on the street. Ida had been in that bucket line until 3 in the morning, her arms aching, her hair full of smoke, her lungs burning. She had helped save the house even though it was not her house. Afterwards, she had sat on the ground outside with soot on her face and her hands in her lap and thought, "This is the second time. This is the second time I have started from zero," because she had lost her saved belongings in the barn. Not all of them. The flour sack with the Bible and the tintype and the folding knife had been in her room, but her trunk of clothing, the small pieces of furniture she had acquired, the wedding dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a catalog and sewn in the evenings after her shifts, all of it gone. She remade the dress. She ordered more fabric. She worked double shifts at the laundry she had taken a job at when she moved to Caldwell. She did not collapse and she did not quit, but something inside her had shifted, some quiet certainty that had been there since childhood, some bedrock confidence that things would be all right in the end, and she was aware of its absence the way you are aware of a tooth that has been pulled, a hollow space where something solid used to be. The wedding did not happen because 3 days before it was scheduled, the Caldwell sheriff arrived at Ida's rooming house and sat down with her in the parlor and told her that Harlan Voss was not a cattle broker. He was a weapons runner who had been supplying rifles and ammunition to 3 outlaw gangs operating across Kansas and Indian Territory. He had been arrested the previous afternoon. She sat with that information for a long time. Then she asked the sheriff how long he had known. He told her a deputy United States marshal had been investigating Harlan Voss for nearly a year. She asked the sheriff for the marshal's name. She was told it was a man named Benjamin Townsend, out of the federal office in Fort Worth, Texas. Ida Covington gathered what remained of her things. She sold the fabric for the wedding dress back to the dry goods store for half of what she had paid for it. She counted her savings. She wrote exactly 1 letter to Clara Finch in Dodge City, because Clara was the only person she knew who gave honest advice, and she explained the situation and asked whether Clara knew of any good place to make a fresh start. Clara wrote back within 2 weeks. She said that a town called Harrow Creek in northwest Texas was growing fast, that it had a new mill and a school and a church and a mercantile, that the population was nearly 400 people and rising, and that a woman who could cook and manage herself could find work and community there. Ida folded the letter, put it in the flour sack with the other things that mattered, packed everything she owned into a single carpet bag, and bought a ticket on the southbound stage. She arrived in Harrow Creek on a September morning in 1881 when the mesquite was dry and gold, and the sky was the particular blue that belongs only to the Texas plains. She was 25 years old and she had started from nothing 3 times. She was not starting from nothing a 4th time. She was starting from herself, which was something, and she intended to treat it as enough. The first person she met in Harrow Creek who was not trying to sell her something was a woman named Ruth Ann Pollard, who ran the town's only bakery out of the front room of her house on the main street. Ruth Ann was 40, broad-shouldered, and had a laugh that made the flour dust jump off the shelves. She hired Ida on the spot to help with the morning baking and told her she could rent the small room in the back of the house for $2 a month. The second person Ida met was Benjamin Townsend. She did not know he was Benjamin Townsend at first. She saw him across the street from the bakery on her 3rd morning in Harrow Creek, a tall man in a brown coat who was talking to the local sheriff, a round-faced man named Walter Pruitt. The tall man had a federal badge she could see even from across the street, and a way of standing that suggested he was always slightly aware of everything around him. Not nervous, not suspicious, just attentive in the way of someone whose attention had saved him more than once. She noticed him the way you notice something well-made briefly, appraisingly, and then you look away. She looked away. She had more pressing concerns. She had a new job and a new town and a history she was not going to let define her, and the absolute last thing she needed was to notice a man. She spent her first month in Harrow Creek learning the rhythms of the town and the rhythms of the bakery and the rhythms of Ruth Ann Pollard, who was generous and sharp, and whose husband had died of a fever 2 years prior, leaving her with the bakery and a garden and a stubbornness that Ida recognized because she was in possession of the same thing. Ida was good at the work. She had always been good at learning what was required and doing it well, which was a quality that looked like talent but was mostly just attention and persistence. She learned Ruth Ann's recipes for the bread and the dried apple pies that were the bakery's biggest sellers, and she contributed 3 recipes of her own: a ginger cake, a cornbread sweeter than the standard, and a molasses cookie that the children of Harrow Creek began to refer to as the cookie from the lady at Ruth Ann's. She made friends at the church, where she went on Sundays less from deep conviction than from a genuine desire for community and the music, which was rough but earnest. She made friends at the Wednesday sewing circle that met at the schoolteacher's house, a young woman named Margaret Perry who had come from Ohio and was still slightly astonished by the landscape. She made friends with the barber's wife and the miller's oldest daughter and a half-Cherokee woman named June who lived 2 miles outside of town and traded herbs and dried plants for flour and sugar at the bakery. She built a life. She built it carefully and steadily, the way you build anything that has to last. And then, on a Wednesday in October, exactly a month after her arrival, Ruth Ann asked her to bring a box of bread loaves across the street to the sheriff's office because Walter Pruitt had put in an order and was too occupied with a prisoner to come collect it. Ida carried the box across the street and walked into the sheriff's office and found, behind the desk that was normally occupied by the round-faced Walter Pruitt, the tall man in the brown coat. He looked up. She said, "I have bread for Sheriff Pruitt." He said, "He is out. I am using his desk. I am Benjamin Townsend, Deputy United States Marshal. You can leave it here." She set the box on the desk and turned to go, and he said, "Are you the woman who came from Caldwell?" She stopped. She turned back slowly. "Where did you hear that?" "Small town," he said. "People talk." "They do," she said, and looked at him carefully. "And what did they say about the woman from Caldwell?" "That she survived a flood and a fire and came here to start fresh, and that she makes a molasses cookie that has the children of this town completely devoted." She studied him. He was younger than she had initially guessed, early 30s, perhaps, with lines at the corners of his eyes that were from weather and attention rather than age, and a quality of stillness that she associated with people who had been in real danger and learned not to waste energy on manufactured drama. "The woman from Caldwell," she said, "prefers to be called Ida Covington." "Benjamin Townsend," he said again, and reached across the desk to shake her hand, which was the kind of thing most men in 1881 did not do with women they had just met, and she found herself extending her hand before she had decided to. His grip was firm and brief, and he looked her in the eye when he did it. She walked back across the street to the bakery and told herself she had more pressing concerns. She was right, and she was also lying to herself, which she recognized but chose not to examine closely. Benjamin Townsend was in Harrow Creek on an investigation that he had not made public, which was not unusual for federal marshals, who generally worked better when the people they were investigating did not know they were being investigated. He had been assigned to Harrow Creek by his supervisor in Fort Worth because there was credible intelligence that one of the 3 outlaw gangs that had been supplied by Harlan Voss before Voss's arrest was operating out of the Harrow Creek area. He was looking for a man named Cole Driscoll, who was known to ride with at least 6 other men, and was suspected in 2 bank robberies and the murder of a federal courier who had been carrying payroll west of Amarillo. What he had not anticipated when he arrived in Harrow Creek was Ida Covington. He knew her name because the investigation into Harlan Voss had required him to know everything about Harlan Voss, including the fact that Voss had been engaged to a woman in Caldwell who was described in the case files as a local woman of good character, seemingly unaware of subject's criminal activity. He had read that description and moved past it, the way you read background information that is relevant to the shape of a case but not to its center. But then he had looked up from Walter Pruitt's desk, and there she was, carrying bread, and he had known immediately who she was, and something in his chest had done something unexpected and inconvenient. He told himself it was guilt. He had, after all, been the architect of an investigation that had destroyed her engagement without any warning or preparation. That was a reasonable thing to feel guilty about. He told himself this and believed it for approximately 3 days. On the 4th day, Sheriff Pruitt mentioned at breakfast at the diner that Ida Covington had organized the women of the town sewing circle to make new curtains for the schoolhouse, and had done it in 2 evenings, and had also somehow persuaded the miller to donate the fabric. And Benjamin found himself putting down his fork and looking out the window in the direction of the bakery and thinking something that had nothing to do with guilt. He went to the bakery that afternoon on the pretext of purchasing bread, which he did not need because he was taking his meals at the diner. He paid for a loaf and a molasses cookie and talked to Ruth Ann Pollard for 10 minutes about the weather and the town, and Ida came through the back door with flour on her apron and looked at him and said, "Back again, Marshal." "Townsend," he said, "or Benjamin. Marshal makes it sound formal." "It is formal," she said. "You are wearing a badge. The badge comes off at sundown." "I will believe that when I see it," she said, and went back through the door, and Ruth Ann Pollard looked at him with the expression of a woman who finds a situation amusing and is not going to say so. He came back the next day without the pretext. He simply came in, sat down on the stool at the counter and said, "I want to apologize to you." Ida set down the bowl she was carrying. She was very still. "For what specifically?" he told her. He told her that he was the marshal who had investigated Harlan Voss. He told her that he had known about her engagement. He told her that the decision not to warn her had been a deliberate operational choice made to protect the investigation, and that he had considered that choice necessary at the time, and that he had also, in the weeks since, come to believe it had been wrong. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Did you know I was here before you arrived in Harrow Creek?" He hesitated a fraction of a second too long. Yes, he said. She picked up the bowl. I need to think about that. She thought about it for 4 days, during which she did not speak to him except to serve him bread when he came in, which he did every single day, which she found both irritating and something she could not quite name. On the 5th day she said, I have decided to accept the apology. He looked at her with something that was relief and something else. Why? Because you came and offered it when you did not have to, and because you told the truth about knowing I was here, when a smaller man would have lied about that, and because I am tired of carrying anger at people who do not deserve to have me spending that much energy on them. She looked at him directly. Harlan Voss is not worth my anger. You are a more complicated case. I will try to be worth your forgiveness, he said. You will have to, she said. I do not give it lightly. What followed was slow and it was careful, and it was unlike anything Benjamin Townsend had experienced with a woman before, which was not because he had no experience. He was 32 years old and had lived a life with some breadth to it, but because Ida Covington was unlike anyone he had met. She was not guarded in the way of someone who was afraid. She was guarded in the way of someone who had evaluated the terrain and determined that caution was the intelligent response to what the terrain had offered so far. She was funny in a dry, quiet way that caught him by surprise consistently. She asked questions that were not polite filler but actual questions she wanted the actual answers to. She did not perform interest. When she was interested, you knew it. When she was not, you also knew it. He found her absolutely absorbing. They fell into the habit of walking on Sunday afternoons after church, which was partly because Harrow Creek was a small enough town that unmarried men and women did not have many settings in which to know each other, and partly because Ida had told him flatly that she did not wish to be courted in a conventional sense, having been courted conventionally and found it insufficient, and that she would prefer to simply spend time with him and see what emerged. What emerged on their first Sunday walk was that he had grown up on a farm in Missouri and had become a marshal at 24 after a man had robbed and killed his uncle in broad daylight on a public road and been acquitted by a jury that was either bribed or afraid. And he had decided that the law needed people who would pursue it beyond the walls of a courtroom. What emerged on their second Sunday walk was that she had been angry at her father for going back in for the mule, and that she had never said that aloud to anyone, and that the anger and the grief had been braided together so tightly she had not been able to separate them until recently. He did not offer comfort in the form of easy words. He walked beside her and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is the most honest thing I have heard in a long time." She looked at him sideways. Most people say something gentle and reassuring. Most people are uncomfortable with honesty that has thorns in it, he said. I am not. She did not fall in love with him on that Sunday, but something shifted in the same quiet way that something had shifted after the fire, except this shift was not a loss. It was an opening. November came in with cold winds from the north and a sky that looked hammered out of pale iron, and with it came trouble. Cole Driscoll's gang robbed the Harrow Creek Merchant Bank on a Tuesday morning. Ida was in the bakery when it happened. She heard the shots, 2 of them, flat and hard in the cold morning air, and then the sound of horses at full gallop on the main street, and then silence, and then the particular noise a town makes when something violent has happened and everyone is still trying to understand it. She walked out to the street. Benjamin was already running toward the bank, his hand on the revolver at his hip, badge out. She watched him go. She noted that her heart was doing something it had not done for any of the 3 disasters in her past. It was hammering for a specific person rather than for her own survival. She noted this and went back inside and finished the bread. He came back 3 hours later with a crease along his jaw from a bullet that had passed close enough to do that much. She opened the bakery door before he knocked and said nothing, only stepped aside to let him in. She cleaned the wound with clean water and a cloth while he sat on the stool at the counter and told her what had happened. Driscoll's men, 6 of them. They had taken $400 and shot the bank clerk in the shoulder knot fatally and ridden north toward the breaks. "Will you go after them?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She tied off the bandage she had made from a strip of clean linen. Her hands were steady. His were too. They were very close together in the small space behind the bakery counter, and neither of them moved back. "Be careful," she said, which was the smallest and most complete thing she could say. He looked at her for a moment that was longer than necessary. "I will come back," he said. She held his gaze. "I know, that is not what I said. I said be careful." He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile in a way that reached all the way through his face, and she wanted badly and immediately to say something that would make him do it again. She stepped back instead and straightened her apron. "Go then. Bring Prout and whoever else and go." He was gone for 9 days. 9 days during which Harrow Creek tried to go about its business and did a poor job of it. The bank clerk recovered. The town held a meeting at the church about safety, and whether Harrow Creek needed more law and what could be done. Ida attended the meeting and listened, and when asked by Ruthen to share her perspective as someone who had recently arrived, said that in her experience, the best defense against men who preyed on communities was a community that knew itself well enough to notice when something was wrong before it became a crisis. Walter Prout looked at her with mild surprise, as though he had not expected the woman from the bakery to say something useful. She was accustomed to that expression and paid it no mind. On the 9th day Benjamin came back, riding into Harrow Creek in the afternoon with Walter Prout and 3 other men and Cole Driscoll in irons, along with 2 of his riders. The other 4 had scattered into the breaks and would be the subject of a separate pursuit. Driscoll himself was going to the federal jail in Fort Worth, which was where he should have been for the past 2 years, and which he would now reach because of the bandaged man on the horse at the front of the group. Ida watched from the doorway of the bakery. When Benjamin rode past, he looked across the street and found her in the doorway, and the look that passed between them was brief and absolute, and said a number of things that neither of them had yet said in words. He turned Driscoll over to the regional federal authority the following morning, wrote his report in 3 hours, and then did something that surprised him. He went to the bakery not because he had a professional reason to be there, but because being anywhere else seemed like a waste of time. He knocked on the back door, which was Ruthen's entrance and therefore also Ida's. Ruthen opened it, looked at him with that particular expression that she had been deploying for several weeks, and called over her shoulder, "Ida, someone is at the door." Ida came to the door. He said, "I came back." She said, "I see that." He said, "I thought about you while I was gone." More than was strictly professional, she leaned against the door frame. The morning light was behind her, and she had flour on her chin, and her hair was pinned up in a practical way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with keeping it out of the bread dough, and she was the most completely present person he had ever stood in front of. "That is a significant statement," she said. "I am aware of that." "I thought about you too," she said. "That is also a significant statement, and I am making it deliberately so you understand what it means." He did understand. He understood that Ida Covington did not say things she did not mean, and that her saying this was not an opening conversational move but a declaration of something real. "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" he asked. "At the diner, not for any professional reason." "Yes," she said, "I would." What happened over the following 2 months was something that Ida would later describe, when she was in a mood to describe it at all, as the gradual and mutual lowering of extremely sensible fortifications. It was not a swooping, overwhelming thing. It was not like the flood or the fire, nothing that destroyed the existing landscape. It was instead a slow, warm opening, like the way the plains look in the first week of true spring, when the green starts to come up through the brown grass, and you can see, if you look carefully, that the land was ready for this all along. They had dinner on Thursday evenings at the diner, where the owner, a taciturn man named Forrest Buell, gave them the table in the corner without being asked. They walked on Sunday afternoons. Occasionally, they sat on the steps of Ruth Ann's porch in the evenings after the bakery was closed and the day's work was done, and talked until the stars were fully out. He told her about Missouri, about his family's farm and his brothers, and the uncle who had been killed on the road, and how that death had rerouted the course of his life. He told her about the years of marshal work, the cases that had gone well and the ones that had not, the compromises that the work required that he was still making peace with. She told him about the flood in granular detail she had never shared with anyone, the texture of the mud, the particular sound the farmhouse had made when it came to rest against the cottonwoods, the walk through the mud to the high ground, the cottonwood leaves pressing against her face in the current. She told him about the fire and the ash smell that had stayed in her clothes for weeks afterward. She told him about Harlan Voss and the engagement, and she told it plainly, not as a wound she was showing, but as a story she had processed and now owned. When she finished, he said, "You are the most resilient person I have ever met." She looked at him. "People say that as though resilience is a gift," she said. "It is not a gift. It is what you build when you have no other option." "Maybe," he said. "But not everyone builds it. Not everyone gets up. You did every time." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark and the stars. "I have been afraid," she said, "that if I let myself—" She paused, started again. "I have been afraid that the things I care about most are the things I lose." He was quiet too for a moment. He understood exactly what she was saying. "I know. I have been afraid of the same thing. The men I care about in the work do not always come back." "Is that why you are careful with people? Is that why you are careful with people?" They looked at each other and they both almost laughed, which was perhaps the most intimate thing that had happened between them. He reached across the porch step and took her hand. She let him. They sat there for a long time in the dark and the stars, and when she finally stood to go inside, he stood too, and he said, "I do not want to be careful about you anymore." She turned to look at him. "I mean," he said, "I want to be careful with you. That is different." She studied his face in the dark for a long moment, reading it the way she had learned to read it, and what she found there was not performance and not strategy. It was simply him. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "Come back for breakfast." "I will," he said. She went inside. He stood on the porch for a moment in the cold night air, and something in his chest that had been careful and contained for a very long time simply let go. December arrived, and with it, the difficulty. The difficulty arrived in the form of a letter from Benjamin's supervisor in Fort Worth, a man named Hollis Crane, who was efficient and direct, and who informed Benjamin by post that his assignment in Harrow Creek was being extended specifically to pursue the 4 members of Driscoll's gang who had fled into the breaks, but that following the resolution of that matter, he would be reassigned to a new case in New Mexico territory, which would likely require a year or more of work out of the Socorro field office. Benjamin sat with this letter for 2 days before he told Ida about it. When he told her, they were at the dinner table at Forrest Buell's diner, and she went very still in the way she went still when she was processing something significant, and he watched her and said nothing, letting her have the silence. "New Mexico," she said finally. "It is not decided yet," he said. "There are things I can do. I can request a different assignment. I can—" He stopped. "I want to be honest with you. The request may not be granted. The marshal service goes where the work is." "I know," she said. "What I am asking," he said, and his voice was steady because he was making himself keep it steady, "is whether there is something here worth me making that request for. And I am asking you directly because you have told me you prefer directness." She looked at him across the table. "You know there is," she said. "Do not be a fool about it." He almost smiled. "I needed to hear you say it." "I know you did," she said, "and I needed you to ask. There, we are both confirmed." He did make the request. He wrote to Hollis Crane in Fort Worth and laid out his case for remaining in the Harrow Creek area to complete the capture of the remaining Driscoll gang members, which was a genuine operational need, and mentioned that he had established local ties that would benefit future investigations in the region, which was also genuinely true. though the nature of those ties was not something he elaborated on in official correspondence. Crane wrote back in 3 weeks. He granted the extension, but was characteristically non-committal about what came after. 3 weeks was a long time to wait when you were in the middle of something that felt urgent. Benjamin spent those 3 weeks doing his job, tracking the movements of the 4 remaining Driscoll men, coordinating with Prout, making inquiries in the neighboring settlements, and also finding every possible legitimate reason to be at the bakery. Ruth Ann Pollard, who was perceptive and had no patience for pretense, told him one morning in the 3rd week, "You are in love with her. You should say so." He looked at Ruth Ann. "With respect, Mrs. Pollard, the respect is not necessary," said Ruth Ann. "The honesty is. She has been hurt by men who were not honest, and she deserves one who is." He thought about that for the rest of the day. That evening, walking with Ida along the edge of town where the road curved toward the open plain, and the last of the winter sunset was burning copper and violet behind the hills, he stopped walking and turned to face her. She stopped too. "I love you," he said. It was the plainest way to say it, and he had decided that plain was what she needed to hear, not something dressed up or elaborate. She looked at him for a long moment, and the copper light was on her face and her eyes were full of something complicated and true. "I know," she said softly. "I have known for a while. Then you know what I need to hear." She reached out and took his hand, both hands, and held them. "I love you too," she said. "That is a terrifying thing to say, and I am saying it anyway." "It is terrifying," he agreed. "Why are we standing here being terrified?" she said. He stepped forward and kissed her. It was the first time, and it was not dramatic in the way of the things that had been dramatic in her life. It was instead the kind of kiss that is simply true, warm and deliberate and completely real, with the plains wind on their faces and the fading light, and the sound of Harrow Creek going about its Thursday evening behind them. When she stepped back, she was not crying, which she had half expected herself to be. She was simply more awake than she had been a moment before. "Dinner tomorrow," he said. "Dinner tomorrow," she said. "And Benjamin." "Yes. When Crane's letter comes, we decide together, whatever it says." He looked at her, and the thing in his chest that had let go in November did something further that he lacked the vocabulary for. "Together," he said. Crane's letter came in January, and it said what Benjamin had most hoped it would say. The Harrow Creek and Northwest Texas region was being designated a permanent federal marshal zone, given the level of outlaw activity, and Benjamin Townsend was being offered the permanent posting if he wished it. He read the letter twice, standing in the cold outside the post office, and then he walked directly to the bakery. Ida was kneading bread dough at the work table when he came through the back door. She looked up. He held out the letter. She read it. He watched her read it, the movement of her eyes across the page, the change in her expression from careful attention to something that was relief and something that was happiness, and he noted something she was trying to keep measured. She set the letter down on the table. She looked at him. There were small clouds of flour in the air between them from the bread dough. "This is what you want," she said. "This is part of what I want," he said. She understood him. She had always understood him faster than he expected. "Say the rest." He moved around the work table and stood in front of her. He had thought about how to do this and had decided, as with everything else involving Ida Covington, that simplicity was the only approach. "Ida," he said, "I would like to marry you. I am asking you, not telling you. I am asking because I want the life we would have together, not because it would be convenient or because it solves a problem. Because I would choose it regardless of any other circumstance." She was very still. "I know," he said, "what it means for you to be asked this again. I know what happened the last time. And I know that what I am offering is not the same as that, because I am not the same as that. I am asking you to trust me with something you have very good reasons to protect." She was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably 30 seconds. "I believe you," she said. "That is the part that surprises me, not that you asked, that I believe you." "Is that a yes?" She looked at him with the clarity that was one of the things he loved most about her. "That is a yes," she said. Ruth then Pollard burst into extremely uncharacteristic tears when told, which made Ida laugh harder than she had laughed in years. June, the half-Cherokee woman who brought herbs to the bakery, gave them a bundle of dried sage tied with red thread and said it was for a new beginning, and Ida hung it on the wall of her room and left it there. The wedding was planned for March of 1882, which gave them 2 months. In those 2 months, the last 2 members of Cole Driscoll's gang were located and captured, one in a settlement 30 miles north of Harrow Creek, one in Indian Territory who surrendered without resistance and looked, Benjamin reported, like a man who had simply run out of energy to run. The federal case against Driscoll was proceeding in Fort Worth. The violence that had characterized the fall was settling. Ida in those same 2 months did not make another wedding dress. She said this to Ruthen when they were discussing it, and Ruthen looked at her questioningly. "I made a wedding dress before," Ida said. "It burned in a fire. I'm not going to make another one just to have something to wear. I have a blue wool dress that I made last fall, and it is good quality, and I look well in it, and that is what I am wearing." Ruthen considered this. "That is entirely practical." "Yes," said Ida. "I intend to be practical about everything except the things that deserve otherwise." "And which things deserve otherwise?" Ida thought about it. "Him," she said simply. The wedding was on a Saturday in mid-March when the first green was coming up in the grass outside town, and the sky had softened from its winter iron to something lighter and warmer. It was in the church, because Ida wanted it in the church, not for reasons of ceremony, but because the church was where she had found her first community in Harrow Creek, and it seemed right to mark the occasion in the same place. Margaret Perry decorated the pews with dried wildflowers and greens from June's garden. Ruth then baked a cake that was by general consensus the finest thing she had ever produced, a 3-layer affair with dried fruit, and a ginger frosting that people who were there would still describe accurately 20 years later. Walter Prout stood up with Benjamin. Ruth then stood up with Ida. When Ida walked into the church in her blue wool dress, and her hair pinned up with the small tortoiseshell combs that had belonged to her mother, every person there understood that they were watching someone who had lost everything several times and was still standing, still choosing, still entirely herself. Benjamin stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and the expression on his face was one that Ruthen Pollard would later say was the most useful expression I have seen on a man's face in 15 years, by which she meant it was completely without pretense. It was simply a man looking at the person he loved, without performance or armor. The ceremony was brief and honest. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, which they had both decided was right because the traditional words meant what they meant and they meant it. But Benjamin had also written 3 sentences that he said at the end, which the minister permitted because the minister was a practical man in his own right and had good judgment about when to be flexible. The 3 sentences were, "You have built something from nothing more times than most people are asked to build something from everything. I intend to be someone who builds alongside you rather than someone who requires you to rebuild from me. And I will tell you the truth, even when it has thorns." Ida stood there and held his hands and looked at him and said, "I know you will. That is why I am here." They were married. The reception was at Ruthen's and lasted until 9 in the evening, at which point Ruthen declared herself tired and shepherded everyone out with a generosity and firmness that was entirely characteristic of her. Benjamin and Ida walked home through the March night to the small house that the Federal Marshal Service provided for the permanent posting, 2 rooms and a kitchen, on the east side of town with a porch that faced the plains, and stood on that porch together in the dark for a moment before going in. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "We are married." "We are," he agreed. She turned to look at the plains, the vast dark spread of them with the stars above. He stood beside her and felt the warm pressure of her shoulder against his. "I am not afraid," she said. It sounded like she was reporting a fact that surprised her. "Neither am I," he said. They went inside. The year that followed was the first year of Ida's adult life in which nothing was destroyed. She had not realized, until she was living it, how much of her energy had been oriented around the expectation of loss. Not consciously, she had not walked around her previous life expecting things to be taken from her, but somewhere below the conscious level, she had always been slightly braced. She had always been ready to rebuild. In the first year of her marriage to Benjamin, the thing she discovered was that you could unclench that brace, that you could live in a house and love the house and not be perpetually preparing for the day it would be gone. That you could love a person with the full weight of your attention and your feeling rather than the carefully rationed portion that you kept in reserve in case of loss. It was a different kind of living. It was more tiring in some ways because it required more of her than the careful ration had, and it was more alive in every sense she had. Benjamin was, as a husband, precisely what she might have guessed from the man she had come to know before the wedding: direct, attentive, honest to a degree that occasionally startled her even though she had been warned, and entirely uninterested in performance. He was also, which she had known but not quite accounted for, someone who found her genuinely interesting, who engaged with her thinking and her observations and her opinions as though they were worth engaging with, which she had encountered rarely enough in her life that it still occasionally surprised her. He was also, she noted in the privacy of her own mind, a very good husband in the ways that did not need to be discussed in polite company, which contributed to a happiness she had not fully anticipated. She continued at the bakery. He had not asked her to stop, and she had not intended to. The work was part of her life and her community and herself, and a wedding ring did not change that. Ruth then had, in fact, made her a partner in the business by the summer of 1882, which meant Ida had a stake in the thing she was building rather than merely wages from it. They expanded the bakery in August. A new oven, a second work table, and Ida's idea of selling ready-baked meals on Friday evenings for families who wanted a cooked supper without the labor. This idea was so successful that within 6 weeks they were turning away orders, which meant they needed help, which meant they hired 2 women sisters named Dottie and Frances Amberg, who had come to Harrow Creek when their brother took work at the mill, and the bakery became something larger than it had been. In December of 1882, Ida discovered she was expecting a child. She told Benjamin on a Sunday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper. She put the information plainly because that was how she operated. "I believe I am going to have a baby in the summer. I am happy about this and I am also frightened, and both of those things are equally true." He was quiet for a moment and she could see him absorbing it, not performing absorption, actually absorbing it, the way the news was large and deserved the space of a real breath. "I am happy about it too," he said, "and frightened too. Those are both true." She looked at him. "We are saying the same thing." "We often do," he said. "I find that reassuring rather than uncanny." She laughed, which broke something in her chest that had been holding itself carefully together. And then they sat there together in the kitchen with the lamp burning and talked about it. About the fear, which was real because childbirth on the frontier in 1882 was a serious undertaking, and about the happiness, which was also real and larger, and about the practical things, which they both felt better for discussing. Ida continued working at the bakery through the spring. She was healthy and strong and saw no reason to stop, and the town doctor, a careful young man named Dr. Samuel Yates, who had come to Harrow Creek from Dallas the previous year, confirmed that she was progressing well, and that working was no impediment to that. June brought her herbs and specific teas, and told her things about the progression of a pregnancy that were not in any medical textbook but were extremely useful, and Ida trusted June in this as in other things. The baby came in late July of 1883, on a night when the plains were hot and the coyotes were loud, and Benjamin sat outside the bedroom door and was, by every available account, the most anxious he had been in his entire professional career, including the 9 days pursuing Cole Driscoll. The baby was a boy. He was healthy, loud, and indignant in the way of all newborns. And when Dr. Yates placed him in Ida's arms, she looked at him for a long moment and then looked up at Benjamin, who had been allowed in the moment all was well, and said, "Hello, we were expecting you." Benjamin sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around his wife and looked at his son, and the thing in his chest that had been letting go in stages for the past 2 years let go of one more thing, some last piece of protection he had kept up without knowing he was keeping it. "What do we call him?" Benjamin asked. Ida had been thinking about this. "Gerald," she said. "For my father," he nodded. "Gerald Townsend." "Gerald Benjamin Townsend," she said, correcting the middle, and looked at him with the expression that was still, after more than a year of marriage, capable of doing something significant to his composure. Gerald Benjamin Townsend grew quickly and with great enthusiasm, as though he had been told the world was interesting and intended to verify this personally. He had his mother's eyes, a particular clear gray-brown that looked different in different lights, and his father's way of going very still and attentive when something was worth paying attention to. He was also, by 18 months, already demonstrating an interest in everything in the bakery, which delighted Ruth then and caused a certain amount of careful supervision around the hot oven. Life in Harrow Creek was settling into something that Ida would have called, in the careful private language of her own heart, good. Not perfect. The frontier was not a place where anything was permanent or without friction, and the marshal work brought its own strain, and there were droughts in 1884 that hit the farming families hard, and the town helped as it could, but it was not enough, and that was a sorrow that lived in the community. But the word for what she had, when she allowed herself to name it, was good. She had the bakery, which was now genuinely thriving. She had her Sunday walks, now with Gerald on her hip, or, when he was older, trotting beside them on his short legs being told about the names of things. She had Ruthan and Margaret Perry and June, and the network of women and families she had built in Harrow Creek over 3 years. She had the house with the porch that faced the plains. And she had Benjamin, who came home every evening and told her the truth about his day, and listened to the truth about hers, and who had not, in 3 years of marriage, given her a single reason to revise her estimate of him downward. But then came the event that returned her to the conversation that had opened this story, the one in the sheriff's office with the gun. It happened in September of 1884, 3 years after Ida's arrival in Harrow Creek and 2 years into her marriage. She came into the sheriff's office looking for Benjamin because she had heard something in town that morning, a rumor, passed from Dottie Amberg to Francis to Ruth and to Ida, the way information moved through a small town like water through connected channels, that Harlan Voss had escaped from federal custody. She had not seen Harlan Voss in 3 years. She had not thought about him frequently in those 3 years, having concluded, correctly, that the energy required for that was better deployed elsewhere. But the news of his escape struck her with the particular force of a thing she had believed was over and resolved that turned out to be neither. She went to the sheriff's office to find Benjamin, because Benjamin was the one who would have accurate information rather than rumor. But when she walked in, it was not Benjamin's face she found first. Walter Prout was sitting behind his desk with a look that told her something was wrong, and standing against the wall behind him was a man she did not recognize, and sitting in the chair across from Prout's desk was Harlan Voss. He had not escaped. He was here under federal escort. He was, apparently, cooperating with a new investigation, and had been brought to Harrow Creek because he had information relevant to criminal activity in the region. He looked up when she walked in, and something moved across his face that she did not examine closely. She looked at him and felt, to her own surprise, very little. Not the anger she might have expected, not the fear. A kind of recognition. Yes, this is the man I remember, and beneath it, a clarity about the distance between what he had represented in her life and what her life had actually become. Then Benjamin walked in through the side door and stopped when he saw her, and the expression on his face told her something that she did not process immediately. It told her he had known Voss was being brought here. She did not make a scene. She turned around and walked out of the sheriff's office and across the street to the bakery and into the back room. And she stood there with her hands flat on the work table and took 3 long breaths. Then she took Ruthen's spare revolver from the shelf, where Ruthen kept it for reasons that were entirely reasonable given that Ruthen was a woman alone in a business on a frontier street. And she went back across the street, and she walked into the sheriff's office, and the gun was already in her hand when Benjamin Townsend walked through the door. "You knew," she said. And that was where the story had begun, or rather, where it had arrived, because stories that begin in media rays do not begin at the real beginning but at the moment of highest truth. The moments that followed were not simple. They never were, between 2 honest people who loved each other. Ida held the gun for 30 more seconds after she had lowered it, not at Benjamin, just held it, the way you hold a thing when putting it down feels premature, and then she set it on the corner of the sheriff's desk. Walter Prout wisely said nothing. Harlan Voss was already in the back cell, having been moved there by the federal escort the moment Ida had walked in the door the first time, because someone with good judgment had seen what was about to happen. "Explain," she said. Benjamin explained. He explained that Voss had been approached by federal authorities about cooperating with a new investigation, a larger investigation, not into the outlaw gangs, but into a land fraud scheme that was affecting homesteaders across 3 territories, taking their claims through forged documents and corrupt county clerks. Voss had, in whatever remained of whatever he had been before his criminal career, decided to help. In return for significant sentencing reductions, he had information that was genuinely useful. He explained that Harrow Creek had been chosen as the location for Voss's deposition because it was a federal marshal posting, and because the information Voss had related to criminal activity in this region specifically. He explained that he had been told about this 2 weeks prior and had not told her because he had been trying to determine whether it was necessary to tell her, and had concluded 2 days before Voss arrived that it was necessary and had been planning to tell her that evening. 2 days, she said. "Yes. You should have told me the moment you knew." "I should have," he said. He did not argue it. "I was trying to protect you from something that upset you, and I forgot that protecting you from information is not the same as protecting you." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is the right thing to say," she said. "I need you to understand why it is not just automatically enough." "Tell me why," she told him. She told him about the experience of having a man, the previous man, know things about her life and not tell her, and what that had cost her. She told him that the thing she had trusted him with from the very beginning was his honesty, and that 2 weeks of withheld information, even with the best intentions, was a crack in that foundation. He listened to all of it. "You are right," he said. "I made the wrong call, not for the wrong reasons, but wrong." "Can you promise me," she said, "that it will not happen again? Not the general category of difficult information. I know your work produces difficult information and I have never asked you to shield me from it. But specifically this kind of decision where you know something that directly affects me and you choose to wait." "I can promise you that," he said, "and I will keep it." She picked up the revolver and took it back across the street to Ruthen's shelf. When she came back, Benjamin was waiting on the front step of the bakery. She sat down beside him on the step and they were quiet for a moment. "Harlan Voss," she said. "He will be here for 3 days for the deposition and then he goes back to federal custody," Benjamin said. "You will not need to see him." "I saw him," she said. "It was not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "More," she said. "More feeling, more anger, more fear." She thought about it. "I think I expected him to still be the size he was when he was in my life. He is not. He is smaller than he was. People often are when you see them after you have lived past them." She looked sidelong at him. "That is a very wise thing." "I have my moments," he said. Despite herself, she laughed. He took her hand. She let him. "I love you," he said. "I know that does not repair anything I did wrong, but it is true. I know it is true, she said. That is what makes this worth having the conversation at all. They sat there on the bakery step in the September afternoon, and the town went past them, and Gerald was inside with Dottie, learning at the age of 14 months what flour was and what happened when you put your hands in it. I am sorry, Benjamin said. I know, she said. Next time just tell me. Next time, he said, I will. Harlan Voss gave his deposition and went back to federal custody on the third day, as promised. The land fraud investigation proceeded over the following year and resulted in the arrest of 4 men who had stolen homestead claims from families across Kansas, Indian Territory, and North Texas, and the return of a number of those claims to their rightful owners, which was a small correction to an injustice that had ruined lives, and Benjamin was proud of having been part of it. Ida was proud of him too, and said so, and he found that her saying it meant something to him that accolades from the federal service did not quite reach. The crack in the foundation that the Voss incident had made was repaired, as cracks in real foundations are repaired with deliberate attention and time, and the decision to repair rather than pretend it was not there. They talked about it. Not obsessively, not in circles, but honestly, and the honesty was what did the work. In the spring of 1885, Ruth Ann Pollard announced that she was going to her sister in San Antonio for an extended visit and possibly a permanent move, and that she intended to leave the bakery to Ida. Ida sat across from Ruth Ann at the kitchen table with the deed in her hands and said, "Ruth Ann, this is your business." "It was my business," said Ruth Ann. "Now it is yours. You have made it more than it was. That was always going to be the direction this went." She paused. "My sister is lonely, and so am I, in the quiet that has settled here since my husband died. San Antonio has opera. I have always wanted to hear opera." Ida looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You are the most generous person I know." "I am a practical person," Ruth Ann corrected. "I am leaving my business to someone who will make it better than it already is and going to opera. That is not generosity. That is excellent planning." Ruth Ann left in April with 2 trunks and a clear conscience, and Ida received letters from her every 6 weeks for the rest of her life, each one full of opinions about San Antonio and news about the sister and descriptions of musical performances that became increasingly passionate. The bakery, now fully Ida's, continued to grow. She brought Dottie Amberg into a partnership arrangement that gave Dottie a stake and gave Ida the freedom to think larger. They added a second location in the neighboring town of Redwell, 12 miles east, which Frances Amberg managed. They began selling bread and pies by the case to the cattle operations and the railroad crews working through the region, which was a considerable expansion of their market. It was also in 1885 that Ida became involved in the school board, which was having a dispute about whether the new schoolteacher, a man who had come from back east, was teaching the children properly. Ida attended the meetings and spoke clearly, and helped broker a resolution that resulted in better oversight without the removal of the teacher, who was, on the whole, doing a reasonable job with 40 children in one room. Benjamin watched her in this meeting and thought, not for the first time, about what it meant to be the person beside her. He had been in some form of public service since he was 24, had been in danger more times than he could count, had made decisions that required a certain kind of courage regularly. But the kind of courage Ida brought to the school board meeting and to the street outside when someone needed help, and to the bakery and to their kitchen table and to the marriage itself was a different kind, not lesser, not greater, just different, a sustained courage, a daily choosing, a willingness to rebuild and engage and care even when caring had proven itself to be a thing that could be taken from you. He thought about how to say this. On a Sunday in November of 1885, walking the path they had been walking on Sundays for 4 years now, with Gerald between them holding both their hands and announcing his opinions about the grass, he said, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. "I have been thinking about what it means that you are the way you are," he said. I do not mean it as a compliment the way people mean compliment something you say to make a person feel good that floats away. I mean it as an observation about something real." He paused. "Most people are made more cautious by loss. They close up. The losses teach them that things end, and they do not let themselves want things as fully, because the wanting leads to the losing and the losing hurts." She was walking and listening. "You are not like that," he said. "Not because you have not lost things. You have lost more than most. But you want things as fully as if you had never lost anything. You built the bakery when you had nothing. You came to Harrow Creek when you had every reason to never trust a new place. He looked at Gerald, who was swinging between their hands and announcing that the grass was very tall. "You agreed to have this person, which requires a particular kind of courage that I do not think you give yourself credit for." She was quiet for a moment. "I give myself credit for surviving," she said. "I have not always given myself credit for choosing." "Those are different things," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am starting to understand that." Gerald announced that he wanted to be carried, and Benjamin picked him up and settled him on his shoulders, and Gerald beamed at the improved view of the world. "You are the most resilient person I have ever met," Benjamin said. "I have met a great many people. I say it knowing what it means." She looked at him. "What it means," she said carefully, "is not that I do not break. It is that I choose to mend." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." She reached across and took his hand where it held Gerald's ankle, and the 4-year marriage and the Sunday walk and the plains light and the small boy on the broad shoulders were all woven together into something that she held in her awareness, like you hold something very good briefly, carefully, knowing that you are in the middle of something that will matter when you remember it. By 1886, Harrow Creek had grown to nearly 800 people. The railroad had come through, which changed the town in the way the railroad always changed towns: faster, louder, more money moving, more strangers arriving, more of everything, including the things that were not desirable. Benjamin's work increased with the population, but the nature of it shifted. With the Driscoll gang gone and the land fraud ring broken up, it was more about the daily business of law and order, and less about extended investigations into organized crime. He still wore the badge. He still went where the work required. But the work was now rooted in Harrow Creek in a way that felt permanent, and permanence, he had discovered, suited him in a way he had not known it would. In the spring of 1880, Ida had their second child. This time she told him not at the kitchen table but in the bakery, because that was where she was when she knew for certain, and she saw no reason to wait for a particular setting. "Again," she said. He looked up from the loaf of bread he was not technically helping to make but was standing near. "Again. In the autumn, I think." He crossed the bakery and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, which was such an uncharacteristic display for a man who generally showed his feelings through the quality of his attention and the truthfulness of his words, that Dottie Amberg, who was at the far end of the bakery, found something to look at that was not them with considerable urgency. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I am well," she said. "I am happy. I am also aware that this is more complicated with Gerald already here, and I am working out the logistics." "We will work them out together," he said. "I know we will," she said. "That is the part that does not require working out." The baby came in October, a girl this time, a small, fierce-looking person who appeared to have immediate opinions about the world and the world's failure to meet her requirements. They named her Clara, for Clara Finch of the Dodge City boarding house, who had taken in a flood-soaked young woman with nothing but a flour sack and given her a dry place to start again. Ida wrote to Clara Finch to tell her, and Clara wrote back a letter that was 8 pages long and full of the kind of dense, practical, opinionated affection that had characterized everything Clara ever said, and ended with, "I always knew you would be all right. I knew it the moment you walked in my door, and your first question was not about your own losses, but about whether there was anything you could do to help with supper." Ida read this letter 3 times. She tucked it in with the flour sack, which still held the Bible and the tintype and the folding knife, and kept them together in the box on the shelf of the bedroom wardrobe. Gerald was 4 years old when Clara was born, and regarded her with the particular mixture of suspicion and fascination that older siblings have always brought to the arrival of smaller siblings. By Christmas, the suspicion had resolved into a protective devotion that manifested primarily as following her around, explaining things to her at length, which Clara, being 3 months old, received with equanimity. The years settled into themselves. Good years, not unchallenged, because the frontier did not do unchallenged but good. There were droughts that were hard on the community and floods in 1888 that brought the Cimarron memory back to Ida with a vividness that caught her off guard, though this flood was elsewhere and Harrow Creek was not touched. There were difficult cases for Benjamin, a murder in 1888 that he solved, but that lived with him in the way difficult things live with a man who takes his work seriously. And a period in 1889 when the growth of the town and the coming of more settlers brought tensions with the Comanche people who had been on this land before any town was a thought, and Benjamin and Ida both understood those tensions for what they were. The cost of a way of life being imposed on another, a wrong that law could acknowledge but not fully repair. Ida served on the town council for the first time in 1889, which was unusual for a woman in northwest Texas in 1889, and which she accomplished not by making it about the unusualness, but by simply being the person at the meetings who had useful things to say and who said them clearly, until the question was not, should a woman be on the council, but why is Ida Covington not on the council? She attended every meeting and said useful things, and was re-elected 4 times. In 1890, the bakery underwent its largest expansion yet, a new building on the adjacent lot that Ida purchased and built to purpose, with a proper commercial kitchen and a storefront and space for the growing production that was now supplying bread to the railroad cafeteria, 2 hotel dining rooms, and a regular order from the Army post 40 miles west. Benjamin helped her negotiate the contract with the Army, which required the kind of formal legal language that he was more familiar with than she was, and she thanked him by making him a ginger cake, and then pointing out that this was the last time she needed his help with a contract, as she now understood how they worked. "I know," he said, eating the cake. "That is exactly what I was hoping for." She looked at him. "You are very strange," she said. "You married me," he said. "I did," she said, knowingly, with full information. He grinned at her, the grin that was still, after 9 years, capable of doing something to her composure that she found both pleasing and slightly inconvenient. And she went back to the accounts, and the evening was ordinary and warm and precisely what she had once, standing on a cottonwood tree-strewn roof in a flood, thought she might never have. Gerald Townsend at 7 was a serious, curious, intensely verbal person who had inherited his mother's clarity and his father's attentiveness, and combined them into a child who asked questions that occasionally stumped the adults around him. He could ride a horse by 6, was reading above his level at school by 7, and had developed a specific fascination with the natural world that expressed itself in the collection of insects, rocks, and plant specimens that lived in labeled boxes under his bed. Clara at 3 was his opposite in almost every way: quick, physical, interested in doing rather than observing, and in possession of a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. She was also, Dr. Yates noted at her regular checkups, in excellent health, and had never given her parents a worried night on that account, which they received as the gift it was. In 1891, the Federal Marshal Service offered Benjamin a promotion that would have taken him to the district supervisor role in Fort Worth, the same city, where Hollis Crane had once sent him a letter that changed both their lives. The promotion would mean leaving Harrow Creek. He came home that evening and told Ida before he told anyone else. She listened. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to know what you want," he said. "I know what I want," she said. "I want to know what you want. This is your career." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the kitchen, The lamp, the good table they had bought in 1886 to replace the first one, the children's drawings pinned to the wall, the herbs that June had given them hanging from the beam. He looked at his wife. "I want to stay," he said. "I want to stay here. I have built something here that I do not want to leave, and the building is not finished." "What specifically is not finished?" He looked at her with a directness that was, even after 10 years, the thing she loved first and most about him. "We are not finished," he said simply. She tilted her head. "We are not finished even if you take the promotion. We would go to Fort Worth. You would leave the bakery, your council seat, everything you have built here." "I have built things before," she said, "from nothing. I can build them from something which is considerably easier." She paused. "But I also want to stay. This is home." "Yes," he said. "Decline the promotion," she said. "Write to them and tell them you are building something here." He wrote the letter the following morning. The district supervisor who read it, a man named Garrett, who had replaced Holly's crane the previous year, wrote back that he respected the decision and that it had better be a hell of a something Benjamin was building. Benjamin showed Ida the response. She read it. "Tell him it is," she said. He wrote back and told him it was. The year 1892 brought a third child. This one came earlier than expected, not dangerously so, but early enough that it was an anxious few days, and it was a boy, small and determined, who by the first week had made it extremely clear that he intended to stay. They named him Felix, after Benjamin's uncle, the uncle who had been killed on the road in Missouri and whose death had set the course of Benjamin's life. It felt right to give the name to something new and living and good. Felix Gerald Benjamin Townsend, and the name Benjamin was Ida's doing, because she said that if Gerald had received her father's name, then Felix should receive his father's. Grew quickly and loudly, and with a personality that everyone in Harrow Creek agreed was entirely his own, which was to say unlike either parent in its specific texture, though recognizable as theirs in its foundations. 3 children, a bakery empire that employed 8 people and sold to customers in 4 towns, a council seat, a federal marshal posting, a house with a porch that faced the plains. By any measure that the frontier offered for measuring, they had built something substantial. But the thing Ida thought about most in the quiet moments, when the children were asleep and the accounts were done, and she was sitting on the porch in the evening with Benjamin beside her, and the Texas sky doing what the Texas sky did in the evening, which was to open itself into something so vast and so colored that it always struck her freshly, was not the thing they had built, but the fact of having built it. She had been afraid once that the things she loved most were the things she lost. She had been wrong about that. Or rather, she had lost things she loved, and she had survived the losing, and she had found that on the other side of survival was not emptiness but capacity, a greater capacity for the next thing than she had had before. The flood had taken her father and her home. The fire had taken her saved things and her certainty. The broken engagement had taken her belief that she understood what love was. And out of those 3 losses she had come to Harrow Creek with nothing but herself, and she had been wrong about herself being insufficient. Herself had been exactly enough. It had been more than enough. It had been the beginning of everything that mattered. On an October evening in 1893, 12 years after she had stepped off the stage in Harrow Creek with a carpet bag and a flour sack, Ida Covington Townsend sat on the porch with Benjamin and watched the sun go down over the plains. Gerald, now 10, was inside reading. Clara, 6, had fallen asleep on the kitchen floor after refusing to admit she was tired, which was characteristic. Felix, 1.5, was in his father's lap in the porch chair, also asleep, which was less characteristic but explained by a day of unusual energy expenditure. "This is it," she said. Benjamin looked at her. "What is it?" "The thing I was building toward," she said. "I did not know what it was when I was building. I just knew I was supposed to keep building, but this is what it was." He looked out at the plains, then back at her. "Are you satisfied?" he asked. It was not a casual question. He asked it the way he asked all real questions, meaning it, wanting the real answer. She considered it properly. "I am not done," she said. "There are more things to do. The council has been discussing a proper hospital for Harrow Creek for 2 years, and I intend to see that happen. And Francis Amberg told me last week that there is an opportunity in the town of Blanco that we should consider for a third bakery location, which I want to investigate. And Felix is going to need a great deal of attention over the next several years, from what I can already tell." "All true," said Benjamin. "But satisfied," she said. "Yes, I am satisfied." She looked at him. "Are you?" He looked at her with the expression that she had first seen outside the church on the day of their wedding and that she had seen many times since, the expression that was entirely without armor. "Completely," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The plains were going purple and copper in the last of the light, and the coyotes were beginning somewhere in the distance, and the lamp in the kitchen window was warm behind them, and the 3 children who had arrived in the house like facts about the world simply, undeniably true were present and safe in hers. She had survived a flood, a fire, and a broken engagement. She had come to a new place with nothing but what she could carry. She had built a life, and in the building of it she had found a man who loved her fully and honestly and without reserve, and she had loved him the same way. And that love had held through the hard conversations, and the withheld letter, and the gun on the sheriff's desk, and the long years, and the 3 children, and the arguments they had about the things that real people in real marriages argue about. And it had held because they had both chosen daily to hold it. She thought about the cottonwood trees. She thought about standing on a flooded roof and being alive despite everything. She thought about the walk through the mud to high ground, the cold weight of the flour sack, the feeling of ground under her feet that was solid even when everything else was moving. She had been building toward solid ground all along, and she had found it, not because the solid ground appeared without effort, but because she had walked toward it even when she could not see it clearly, and because she had not been alone when she got there. "Benjamin," she said. "Yes. Thank you." He turned his head and kissed the top of her head, careful not to wake Felix. "For what specifically?" he said. She thought about the answer for a moment, the way she thought about things that deserved their full weight. "For building alongside me," she said, "rather than requiring me to rebuild from you." He was quiet. She could feel him absorbing it, the way he absorbed things that mattered. "Always," he said. The sun went below the horizon, and the sky turned the deep blue that followed, and the first stars came out one by one above the plains. And Ida Covington Townsend sat on the porch with her husband and her sleeping child, and the lamp behind her and the stars above her, and the whole of her built life around her. And she was, at 37 years old and without qualification, at peace. She had been the woman who survived. She was also, and more importantly, the woman who built. And what she had built in the end was a life too full and too good and too deeply real to be taken by any flood, any fire, or any broken thing that the world had tried to use against her. What she had built was this: a Tuesday evening in October on a porch with a man who told her the truth and 3 children asleep inside, and 12 years of choosing each other behind them, and all the years ahead still unwritten and still hers. That was the whole of it. That was everything. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, by every measure that had ever mattered to Ida Covington, the truest and most permanent thing she had ever built from the rubble of what she had survived. And she would spend the rest of her long and full and irreplaceable life being grateful for the flood, the fire, and the broken engagement that had brought her, eventually, exactly here.